Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvein. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. Sometimes it's a pattern that probably means nothing, a pattern that can be explained by coincidence, and yet once you notice it, you can never completely stop thinking about it. This is one of those stories for me. I graduated high school in 2012. Like most graduating classes, everyone went their separate ways afterward. Some people moved away. Some went to college. Some started careers. Some got married. Others slowly disappeared from social media until you completely lost track of them. That's just how life works. After graduation, the class that once spent every day together slowly became a collection of distant memories. Every now and then I'd hear news about someone from school, a wedding, a new job, a baby, the usual milestones people reach as they move through adulthood. Then, in 2018, something happened. One of my classmates died. It was shocking. We were still relatively young. When you're in your 20s, death still feels like something that happens to other people. Not people your own age. Not people you sat next to in class. Not people whose names appear in your yearbook. The loss hit a lot of people hard. Friends shared memories online. Former classmates reached out to one another. For a while, everyone reflected on how fragile life can be. Then time moved on, as it always does. The following year, another classmate died. This time it was from an entirely different cause. There was no connection between the two deaths, no shared circumstances, no common explanation, just another young person gone far too soon. It felt strange, uncomfortable, but people told themselves what seemed obvious. It was tragic. But it was also a coincidence. Then came 2020, and another classmate died, again completely unrelated. Again, another tragedy, another funeral, another social media post that made people stop scrolling and stare at their screen. By that point, people had started noticing the pattern. Nobody openly talked about it much, but everyone noticed. 3 years, 3 classmates, 3 unrelated deaths. Then came 2021, and it happened again. Another classmate died. This time it was suicide. 4 consecutive years, 4 members of the same graduating class, 4 completely different causes. An accident, an illness, COVID complications involving a pre-existing condition. Suicide, no conspiracy, no connection, no mystery, just an incredibly unfortunate sequence of events. Yet once those deaths accumulated, something changed in my mind. Because there was another event sitting in the middle of all of it. Something that had happened to me. Back in 2019, before the second classmate passed away, I had my own close call. At the time, I didn't think much about it afterward, at least not compared to how I think about it now. I was riding my bike through town, nothing unusual, just another day. Traffic was moving normally. The weather was fine. Everything felt completely routine. As I approached a junction, a garbage truck began turning. The truck wasn't speeding. The driver wasn't behaving recklessly. As far as I can tell, he simply didn't see me. One moment, everything was normal. The next moment, I was being knocked from my bike. The memory still feels strangely vivid. The size of the truck, the sound of it moving, the realization that something had gone wrong. I ended up on the ground, and for a brief moment, I was in an incredibly dangerous position. The truck kept moving. The driver still hadn't noticed. Then something happened that probably saved my life. A woman nearby saw what was happening. Without hesitation, she ran into the road. She started yelling, waving her arms, doing everything she could to get the driver's attention. Thankfully, it worked. The driver stopped. Later, when I replayed everything in my mind, I realized how close it had been. Not close in the dramatic way people often exaggerate stories. Actually close. Maybe a second. Maybe less. Had that woman reacted any slower, I likely would have gone under the wheels. It's not a thought I enjoy having. But it's the truth. Afterward, I was shaken up. Anyone would be. But eventually, life returned to normal. Or at least I thought it did. Then, the deaths continued. One classmate, then another, and another. Before long, I found myself doing something completely irrational. Something I know doesn't make logical sense. Yet part of my brain keeps doing it anyway. I started wondering if I was supposed to have been one of them. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I really do. I'm not superstitious. I don't actually believe in curses. I don't think some supernatural force is hunting former students from my graduating class. But emotions don't always care about logic. When enough strange coincidences pile up, your mind starts looking for patterns. It's what human brains are designed to do. We connect dots. We search for explanations. We look for meaning even when none exists. And somehow, my brain connected that accident with everything else. The result is that I occasionally find myself thinking about the movie Final Destination. The idea that death somehow missed someone and keeps coming back to correct the mistake. Again, logically I know that's nonsense. Life doesn't work that way. People die for countless unrelated reasons every day. Accidents happen, illnesses happen, tragedies happen. Sometimes several happen within the same group of people purely by chance. Statistics can be cruel. Coincidences can feel meaningful even when they aren't. I understand all of that. Yet every now and then, especially late at night when my mind wanders, I think about those years. 4 years, 4 classmates, and one near miss of my own sitting right in the middle. I think about that woman who ran into the road. A complete stranger. Someone whose name I never learned. Someone who probably has no idea how often I've thought about what she did. Because from my perspective, she didn't just stop a truck. She altered the entire course of my life. Every day I've lived since then exists because she reacted when she did. That's a strange thing to realize. A strange thing to carry around. Maybe that's part of why the whole sequence of events still bothers me. The deaths remind me how fragile life is. The accident reminds me how easily I could have become one of those stories myself. Most days I don't think about it. Most days life feels normal. But every once in a while, usually when I hear news about another unexpected death, the memory comes back. The truck. The junction. The woman shouting. The classmates who never got the same second chance. And the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the line between being alive and being gone is much thinner than we'd ever like to admit. I don't actually believe there's a curse following my graduating class. But I do believe those years taught me something. They taught me that life can change in seconds. They taught me that coincidences can leave lasting scars. And they taught me that sometimes the people who save our lives are complete strangers who happen to be standing in the right place at exactly the right moment. Whoever that woman was, I'll probably spend the rest of my life being grateful she was there. This is one of those experiences that I still can't fully explain. Even now, years later, my wife and I occasionally bring it up when we're talking about strange things that have happened to us. Every time we tell the story, we end up asking the same question. Was it just our imagination? Or was there really something unusual happening that night? A few years ago, my wife and I booked an Airbnb on a farm. We were looking for a quiet getaway, somewhere away from traffic, noise, and the stress of everyday life. The property was beautiful. Instead of one large building, there were several small guest houses spread around the farm. Each one was private and separated from the others by open land and trees. It was peaceful, the kind of place where you could sit outside at night and hear almost nothing. No city sounds, no sirens, no traffic, just the occasional breeze moving through the fields. During the day, it felt relaxing. At night, though, the silence felt different. Not necessarily scary, just different. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound, every creak, every rustle, every movement. Still, our first evening went perfectly fine. We explored the property, had dinner, relaxed for a while, and eventually went to bed. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing seemed out of place, at least not at first. Sometime during the night, I suddenly woke up. I checked the time. It was around 2:30 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. The room was quiet. Everything looked normal. My wife was asleep beside me. There were no strange noises, no obvious reason to be awake. But something felt wrong. It's difficult to explain. Have you ever had one of those moments where your instincts start screaming at you even though you don't know why? That's exactly how it felt. The overwhelming sensation that someone was watching me. I know how ridiculous that sounds. There was no evidence of anyone being there. No movement, no sound, nothing. Yet the feeling was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. I lay there staring into the darkness, listening, waiting, trying to figure out what had woken me. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I told myself I was being irrational. Maybe I'd had a strange dream. Maybe the unfamiliar surroundings had made me uneasy. Maybe it was simply one of those random feelings people get in the middle of the night. Still, I couldn't shake it. The feeling remained. Something felt off. So I stayed awake. I kept scanning the room, looking toward the windows, looking toward the doorway, trying to convince myself everything was fine. About 15 minutes later, something happened that made the situation feel much stranger. My wife suddenly woke up. Not gradually, not the way people normally wake up. She sat up looking genuinely frightened. The first thing she said was that she felt like someone was in the room. The moment she said those words, my stomach dropped. Because I hadn't told her anything. I hadn't mentioned waking up. I hadn't mentioned feeling watched. I hadn't said a single word. Yet she had described almost exactly what I had been experiencing. She looked around nervously and asked me to stay awake while she went to the restroom. I told her, of course. At that point, I wasn't feeling particularly eager to be alone either. She left the room for a few minutes. I remained awake, listening carefully. Everything stayed quiet. No sounds, no movement, nothing unusual. Eventually, she returned and got back into bed. We talked briefly about how strange it felt. Then, after a while, we both convinced ourselves it was probably nothing. The room was secure. The doors were locked. There was no reason to believe anyone had been inside. Eventually, we managed to fall asleep again. By morning, the whole experience felt less dramatic. Sunlight has a funny way of making nighttime fears seem less convincing. We got dressed and headed to breakfast. The farm had a communal area where guests could eat and relax. As we sat there eating, we overheard another guest speaking with the host. At first, we weren't paying much attention. Then, we caught part of the conversation. The woman sounded confused. She was explaining that when she checked her car that morning, something strange had happened. According to her, the vehicle had been locked all night. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing was damaged. Yet when she opened it, both sun visors were hanging down. The glove compartment was open. Items inside the car had been moved around. It looked as though someone had searched through it. But somehow, the doors remained locked. The host appeared just as confused as she was. My wife and I exchanged a look. Neither of us said anything. But both of us were thinking the same thing. What were the chances? We had spent half the night feeling as though something was wrong. Then, the next morning we were listening to another guest describe a bizarre experience of her own. Of course, there were probably logical explanations. Maybe she forgot she'd moved those things. Maybe someone with access to the vehicle had entered it. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable answer. But after the night we'd had, it definitely caught our attention. The strange feeling lingered throughout the day. Eventually, we started researching the area, partly out of curiosity, partly because we couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. That's when we discovered something interesting. The property sat near part of the historic Texas Trail of Independence. The region had witnessed numerous conflicts and battles during Texas history. Over the years, countless stories had emerged about the area. Some historical, some legendary, some involving reports of strange experiences from visitors. Now, I'm not saying any of that proves anything. History doesn't automatically create ghosts. And knowing an area's past after the fact can definitely influence how people interpret unusual experiences. I understand that, but once we learned about it, the events of the night felt even stranger. Two people waking up independently with the same overwhelming feeling. The sense of being watched. The unexplained fear. Then hearing another guest describe a weird experience the following morning. Taken individually, none of those things seem particularly convincing. Together, though, they created a story that neither of us has ever forgotten. To this day, my wife and I disagree about what happened. Some days we laugh about it. Some days we're convinced there must be a rational explanation. Other times we remember exactly how real that feeling was. The feeling that somebody else was in the room. The feeling that we weren't alone, and that's the part that has stayed with us. Not because we saw a ghost, not because we witnessed anything supernatural, but because two people experienced the exact same fear at nearly the exact same time without ever discussing it first. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was suggestion. Maybe it was simply the unfamiliar environment playing tricks on our minds, or maybe there was something else there that night. Whatever the truth is, neither of us has ever completely forgotten that farm, that guest house, or the strange feeling that woke us both up at 2:30 in the morning. There are plenty of ghost stories that scare people. There are stories about haunted houses, shadow figures, strange noises, and unexplained events. But for me, some of the scariest stories are the ones that don't involve anything supernatural at all. Because at least with ghosts, there's always the possibility that they aren't real. This story is frightening because it actually happened, or at least a version of it did. Years ago, I came across a video online that completely changed the way I think about strange noises inside a house. At the time, I was doing what most people do late at night, scrolling through random videos on YouTube. One video caught my attention because the title sounded almost too ridiculous to be true. According to the story, a person living alone had started noticing strange things happening around their apartment. Nothing dramatic at first, just small details, the kind of things most people would probably ignore. Food seemed to disappear faster than expected. Objects weren't always where they remembered leaving them. Tiny changes would appear from time to time. Nothing significant enough to immediately suggest a serious problem, but enough to create an uneasy feeling. At first, the tenant blamed themselves. That's usually what people do. You assume you forgot where you placed something. You assume you miscounted. You assume you're being absent-minded. After all, forgetting things is far more likely than someone secretly living inside your home. As the days passed, however, the strange incidents continued. The feeling that something wasn't right became impossible to ignore. Eventually, the tenant decided to do something simple. They set up a camera. The goal wasn't to catch an intruder. The goal was probably to prove to themselves that they were imagining things. Maybe they would discover they were sleepwalking. Maybe they would catch themselves moving items and forgetting. Maybe the footage would reveal a perfectly ordinary explanation. Instead, it revealed something far worse. When they reviewed the footage, they discovered they weren't alone. A person had been living inside the apartment. Not as a guest, not as a roommate, not someone hiding temporarily. Actually living there. Depending on which version of the story you hear, the individual was hiding in a crawl space, attic area, ceiling compartment, or storage section of the apartment. The details vary depending on the case being discussed. But the footage itself was terrifying. The hidden person would wait until the tenant was asleep or had left for work. Then, they would quietly emerge from their hiding place. They would move around the apartment, open the refrigerator, take food, use the living space, then return to hiding before the tenant came back. Watching that footage for the first time genuinely disturbed me. Not because anything violent happened, not because there was blood or gore, but because of how ordinary it looked. Imagine living your normal life completely unaware that another person is secretly sharing your home. Imagine going to sleep every night believing you're alone. Meanwhile, someone is only a few feet away. Watching, waiting, listening, the idea absolutely got into my head. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even now, years later, the story occasionally pops back into my mind, especially at night. Especially when I hear strange sounds. The worst part is that where I live, we occasionally have possums in the roof. If you've never heard possums moving around overhead, it's difficult to explain how human they can sound. Most people imagine little scratching noises, tiny animal sounds, but that's not always what happens. Sometimes they run, sometimes they jump, sometimes they move across rafters with heavy, deliberate thuds. Late at night, when the house is completely quiet, those sounds can be surprisingly convincing. There have been plenty of nights where I've been sitting alone and suddenly heard footsteps overhead. At least, that's what my brain immediately interprets them as. Footsteps. Someone walking across the roof. Someone moving through the ceiling space. Then logic catches up. It's probably a possum. It has always been a possum. But for a few seconds, my imagination gets there first. And that's where the paranoia starts. The human brain is incredibly good at creating worst-case scenarios. Once you've seen footage of someone secretly living inside another person's home, it's hard to completely forget it. Every strange noise suddenly has a story attached to it. Every unexplained sound feels a little more suspicious. Every creak becomes something worth paying attention to. Most of the time, I laugh at myself afterward. I know how unlikely it is. I know there's almost certainly a reasonable explanation. Yet I still find myself listening carefully whenever those noises happen, trying to identify exactly where they're coming from, trying to convince myself that it's just wildlife. Because honestly, I'd much rather have possums in the roof than a person. The thing that makes the original story so frightening is that it attacks one of our most basic assumptions. We all assume our homes are private. We assume the walls around us separate us from the outside world. We assume that when we lock the door and go to sleep, we're alone inside. That feeling of safety is something most people never even think about until a story comes along that challenges it. That's why the video affected me so much. Not because it was supernatural, not because it was mysterious, but because it was real, or at least realistic enough to happen. No ghosts, no demons, no monsters. Just a hidden person quietly climbing out of a concealed space while someone slept a few feet away. For me, that's far scarier than almost any horror movie. At least when you're watching a horror film, you know the monster isn't real. But stories like this remind you that sometimes the most unsettling things aren't imaginary at all. Sometimes they're ordinary people hiding in places you never thought to look. So whenever I hear something moving across the roof late at night, I usually tell myself exactly the same thing. It's a possum. It's always been a possum. It's definitely a possum. Then I lie there listening for another minute anyway. Some stories are frightening because of what happened. Others are frightening because of what almost happened. This is one of those stories. I didn't experience it personally, but it happened to close family friends of my parents, and it's one of those stories that has stuck with me ever since I first heard it. The reason it stays with me isn't because it involves a mysterious disappearance or some unsolved crime. It's because the people involved came terrifyingly close to becoming victims of one of America's most infamous serial killers. The story took place in Wichita, Kansas, sometime during the late 1980s, although I would have to ask again to remember the exact year. At the time, my parents' friends were living what most people would consider an ordinary life. They had a home in a quiet neighborhood. They worked, spent time with family, and followed the same routines that millions of people follow every day. Nothing about their lives suggested they would ever cross paths with someone whose crimes would eventually become known across the entire country. Like most people, they assumed danger happened somewhere else. To someone else, not in their neighborhood, not on their street, and certainly not inside their own home. But unknown to them, someone had chosen their house. Someone had been watching. Someone had been planning. Years later, investigators would connect the incident to the man who became known as the BTK killer. BTK stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, the name the murderer gave himself while taunting police and the media. Even today, the name sends chills through people who know the details of his crimes. What makes the story even more disturbing is that BTK often spent time studying potential victims before making a move. He wasn't someone who acted purely on impulse. He planned. He watched. He prepared. And according to what police later determined, he had selected my parents' friends as potential victims. One evening, while they were away from home, he entered the house. At the time, they had no idea anyone was inside. No idea someone had broken in. No idea that a predator was waiting for them. According to what they later learned, he gained access through a rear sliding glass door. Once inside, he didn't immediately steal anything. He wasn't there for valuables. He wasn't looking for money. His intentions were far darker than that. Instead, he waited. That's the detail that has always unsettled me the most. The waiting. Imagine someone secretly sitting inside your home, listening, watching, knowing you're eventually coming back, knowing exactly where you'll walk through the door, knowing the layout of the house, knowing you're completely unaware of what's waiting for you. It's difficult to imagine a more vulnerable situation. Fortunately, something happened that wasn't part of his plan. The family owned 2 large dogs, huge dogs, the kind that immediately command attention whenever they enter a room. For most people, they were beloved pets. For an intruder hiding inside a house, they became a serious problem. At some point, BTK realized those dogs were going to make carrying out his plans extremely difficult. Maybe they sensed something was wrong. Maybe they started barking. Maybe their presence alone convinced him the risk was too high. Whatever happened, he abandoned the plan. Instead of staying, he fled. He left the house before the family returned. Without the dogs, the outcome could have been very different. That thought alone is enough to make me uncomfortable. Two animals that had no idea what was happening may have saved multiple lives simply by existing. The family eventually returned home completely unaware of how close they had come to tragedy. At first, they didn't even realize someone had been inside. Only later did investigators discover evidence that pointed toward BTK. Among the items left behind were supplies that suggested preparation for an attack. The one detail I specifically remember hearing about was rope. There may have been other items as well, but rope is the thing that always stayed in my memory, not because rope itself is unusual, but because of what it represented. Preparation, intent, planning. This wasn't a random burglar. This wasn't someone looking for electronics or cash. The items left behind suggested something much more sinister. Eventually, police became involved. After examining the evidence and comparing it with other cases, investigators reportedly concluded that BTK had been responsible for the break-in. What makes the story even stranger is that the family wasn't immediately told. From what I understand, law enforcement waited before revealing exactly who they believed had entered the home. Perhaps they were protecting an investigation. Perhaps they wanted to verify certain details first. Whatever the reason, there was a period of time when the family knew something bad had happened, but didn't fully understand how serious it really was. Imagine learning years later that one of the most notorious serial killers in American history had been inside your house. Not outside. Not in the neighborhood. Actually, inside, waiting, watching, planning, and only a pair of dogs prevented whatever might have happened next. That realization would be difficult for anyone to process. The older I get, the more unsettling the story becomes. When I first heard it, I focused on the serial killer aspect, the famous name, the criminal investigation, the true crime element. Now, what affects me most is how ordinary everything was. The house wasn't unusual. The family wasn't unusual. It could have been anyone. That's often what makes stories involving serial predators so frightening. The victims aren't chosen because they're special. They're often chosen because they happen to be available. Because they fit some pattern only the offender understands. Because they were unlucky enough to attract the wrong person's attention. In this case, luck may have worked in the family's favor. Or perhaps fate. Or perhaps two very large dogs who simply did what dogs do. Whatever the reason, the family got to continue living their lives. They got to grow older, celebrate birthdays, raise families, make memories. All because one terrible plan failed before it could begin. Whenever I hear people talk about how much their pets mean to them, I think about this story. Because sometimes we think of pets as companions. Sometimes we think of them as family. And sometimes, without even realizing it, they become protectors. The truly chilling part is knowing how close the family came to becoming another headline, another case file, another tragedy discussed decades later. Instead, they became something much rarer, the people who narrowly escaped. And all these years later, that possibility is still enough to send a chill down my spine. Because somewhere in Wichita, on an ordinary evening in an ordinary neighborhood, one of America's most notorious killers walked away from a house empty-handed, and the people inside never even knew how close they had come until much later. Some stories never really leave you. You can go years without thinking about them, sometimes even decades. Life moves forward. New memories replace old ones. New responsibilities take over your attention. Then, something reminds you. A photograph, a news article, a familiar street, a name, and suddenly you're right back there again. This is one of those stories for me. When people talk about true crime cases or frightening events, they're usually talking about strangers, people they've read about online or seen in documentaries. This one was different. This involves someone I actually knew. Not extremely well, not a best friend, but someone I had known since kindergarten. Someone whose face I can still remember. Someone who should have had an entire life ahead of him. Instead, his life ended in a way that still feels impossible to understand. I remember him as a normal kid. That's what makes stories like this so difficult. When you hear about a murder on the news, it's easy to see the victim as a name or a photograph. But when you've actually known the person, even if only as a child, it's different. You remember little things, moments in school, conversations, games on the playground, the sound of their voice, the fact that they were a real person, not just a headline. Years ago, tragedy struck his family. From what I remember, his father suddenly snapped. Exactly what was happening in the father's life at the time, I don't know. I was never close enough to the family to know all the details. What I do know is that one day, something terrible happened inside their home. The father murdered multiple members of his own family. My friend was killed. His sister was killed. His mother was killed. Even writing those words feels unreal. 3 lives destroyed inside what should have been the safest place in the world. A family home. According to what people later learned, the attack was brutal. My friend and his sister were reportedly killed first. Their mother was also murdered. Then, as if the crime itself wasn't horrifying enough, the father allegedly rigged the house to explode. It's difficult to comprehend the level of rage and destruction involved. Most people cannot imagine harming a stranger. This involved his own family. The people who trusted him most. The people who lived with him. The people who should have been safest around him. Instead, they became victims. The explosion that followed made the tragedy impossible to ignore. People across the area saw the smoke. One detail I have never forgotten is that the smoke was reportedly visible from the local high school. The sister was supposed to be there that day. She never arrived. While students attended classes and followed their normal routines, something unimaginable had already happened. I often think about that. How quickly life can split into a before and an after. One day, everything feels normal. The next day, an entire family is gone. News spread quickly throughout the community. Everyone was shocked. Stories like that don't stay private for long, especially in smaller communities where people know each other. Parents talked about it. Teachers talked about it. Students talked about it. Nobody could understand how something like that could happen. People searched for answers. They tried to make sense of it. But some things never make sense. Some acts are so destructive that no explanation ever feels sufficient. What made the story even more unsettling was what happened afterward. The father disappeared. As far as I know, he was never immediately found. The last information I remember hearing was that he was being sought by authorities and had ended up on a most wanted list. That detail haunted people almost as much as the crime itself. Because the story didn't have a clean ending. There was no courtroom, no sentencing, no moment where the community could feel that justice had finally arrived. Instead, there was uncertainty. Questions, rumors, people wondering where he had gone, people wondering if he was still alive, people wondering whether he would ever be caught. For years afterward, every time someone mentioned the case, the same question seemed to come up. Had they found him yet? And as far as I knew, the answer remained the same. No. What stays with me most, though, isn't the investigation. It isn't the manhunt. It isn't even the explosion. It's my friend. Because whenever these stories get discussed, people naturally focus on the crime, the violence, the suspect, the headlines. But behind every headline is a person. In this case, a child. A child who should have grown up. A child who should have experienced high school, adulthood, relationships, careers, and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. Instead, his story ended before any of that could happen. When I think about him now, I don't think about the crime first. I think about kindergarten. I think about being kids. I think about a time when life felt simple and the future felt endless. That's the version of him I prefer to remember. Not as a victim. Not as part of a terrible news story. Just as a kid. Because that's ultimately what makes tragedies like this so painful. Not the headlines. Not the investigations. Not even the violence itself. It's the realization that real people were at the center of it. People with futures. People with dreams. People who never got the chance to live the lives they should have had. Years have passed since it happened. The shock has faded. The news coverage has ended. Most people who weren't directly affected have probably forgotten about it. But some stories stay with those who remember. Some names never completely disappear. And every once in a while, when something brings the memory back, I find myself thinking about that little kid from kindergarten and wondering what kind of person he would have become if he had simply been given the chance to grow up. A few years ago, I experienced something that still follows me to this day. I've seen plenty of disturbing things in movies and documentaries. Like most people, I always assumed that if I ever came across something truly horrific in real life, I would somehow know how to handle it. The truth is very different. Nothing really prepares you for stumbling across a dead body, especially when you're completely alone. The day started like any other. I had decided to go for a walk through a wooded area not far from where I lived. It wasn't a popular trail. In fact, I had wandered a little away from the main path because I enjoyed exploring places that most people didn't bother visiting. The woods were quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists away from roads and cities. All I could hear were birds, the wind moving through the trees, and the occasional rustling of leaves beneath my feet. It was peaceful, at least at first. As I walked deeper into the area, I suddenly noticed a smell. At first it was faint, then it became stronger and stronger. Within a few moments it was impossible to ignore. It was a strange smell, sweet, but not in a pleasant way, overpowering, heavy, the kind of smell that immediately makes you stop and wonder where it's coming from. I remember standing there trying to identify it. Part of me wanted to simply turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I've always been the type of person who wants to know the source of something unusual. So instead of walking away, I started looking around. The smell seemed strongest near a patch of thick undergrowth. Branches, bushes, and tangled plants covered the area so heavily that it was difficult to see anything behind them. I stepped closer. The smell intensified. My stomach immediately tightened. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Carefully, I reached out and pulled some of the vegetation aside. For a second, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. Then reality hit me all at once. There was a body, a human body, lying hidden among the brush. I instantly stumbled backward. Shock washed over me. The world suddenly felt unreal. One moment I had been enjoying a peaceful walk. The next I was standing face to face with death. The man had clearly been there for some time. Nature had already begun reclaiming him. The weather had taken its toll. Animals had found him before I had. It was obvious that this wasn't a recent event. The sight was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Even now, years later, certain details remain painfully clear. Not because I want to remember them, but because some images burn themselves into your memory, whether you want them there or not. For several moments, I simply stood there staring. My mind was racing. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. Part of me felt frozen in place. Eventually, I forced myself to take out my phone and call the police. I remember struggling to explain where I was. The area wasn't exactly easy to find. There were no nearby houses, no obvious landmarks, just woods, lots of woods. The operator kept asking questions. Was I certain it was a body? Was anyone else nearby? Was there any sign of danger? Eventually, they told me officers were on their way. Then they asked me something I wasn't expecting. They asked me to remain there until police arrived. Looking back, I understand why. Finding the exact location again could have been difficult. The area was remote and confusing. But at the time, the idea of staying there felt horrible. Still, I agreed. So I waited, and waited, and waited. The problem was that I was deep in the middle of nowhere. Police couldn't arrive instantly. The woods that had felt peaceful earlier now felt completely different. Every sound made me jump. Every crack of a branch caught my attention. As time passed, daylight slowly faded. The sky grew darker. The shadows grew longer. Eventually, the sun disappeared altogether. I found myself sitting alone in the woods at night. Not completely alone, of course. That was the problem. There was someone else there. Someone who would never leave. The body remained only a short distance away. I tried not to look in that direction. I tried distracting myself. I checked my phone repeatedly. I listened for approaching vehicles. I counted minutes. Anything to avoid thinking about what was lying nearby. But it was impossible. My imagination kept dragging me back. Who was he? What had happened? Did someone know he was missing? How long had he been there? Had people been searching for him? Questions filled my mind. The darkness only made everything worse. Every now and then, I would accidentally glance toward the area where the body lay. Each time I immediately looked away. The entire experience felt surreal, like something from a nightmare. Eventually, police arrived. The flashing lights cutting through the darkness felt like the greatest relief imaginable. Officers secured the area and began their investigation. I gave my statement and answered their questions. After some time, I was finally allowed to leave. I went home thinking the worst part was over. I was wrong. The worst part came later. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image would randomly appear in my mind, while eating, while working, while trying to sleep. The smell seemed impossible to forget. Certain details replayed over and over again. I told myself it would fade with time. Instead, something else happened. The dreams started. At first, they were ordinary nightmares. Then, they became more specific. The man from the woods began appearing in them. Sometimes he simply stood there. Sometimes he watched me from a distance. Sometimes he spoke. The strangest part was what he said. In the dreams, he was angry. Not sad, not frightened. Angry, he accused me of disturbing him. Accused me of finding him. Accused me of ruining his peace. The things he said were often disturbing enough that I would wake up sweating. There were nights when I didn't want to go back to sleep. Even though I knew it was only a dream, it still felt unsettling. Dreams have a strange way of feeling real while they're happening. Logic disappears. Emotion takes over. The fear stays with you even after you wake up. Eventually, investigators determined that the man had taken his own life. Learning that provided answers, but it didn't provide closure. If anything, it made the situation even sadder. This wasn't a murder mystery. This wasn't some criminal case. It was a human tragedy. Someone had reached a point where they no longer wanted to continue living. And somehow, I had become the person who found him. Years have passed since that day. Most of the shock has faded. Most of the fear has faded, but the dreams never completely disappeared. Every now and then, without warning, he still shows up. Not often, just enough to remind me. Sometimes I'll go months without thinking about it. Then suddenly, I'll have another dream. Another conversation. Another reminder of that afternoon in the woods. I don't believe the dreams mean anything supernatural. I think they're simply my mind trying to process something traumatic. Finding a dead body isn't something most people ever experience, and when it happens, your brain doesn't always know what to do with it. Still, that doesn't make the dreams any less disturbing. Even now, whenever I walk through wooded areas and catch an unusual smell on the wind, I immediately remember that day. The quiet forest. The overwhelming sweetness in the air. The curiosity that made me look. And the discovery that changed an ordinary walk into a memory I'll probably carry for the rest of my life. This happened about 2 years ago, and even now I still think about it whenever I'm driving alone late at night. I've had plenty of strange experiences in my life, but this is one of the few that genuinely scared me. Not because I know something bad was definitely going to happen, but because I still have no idea what that man was doing out there, or what might have happened if I had stayed any longer. The whole thing started after a family reunion. The reunion was held a couple of hours away from where I lived, and like most family gatherings, it went on much longer than expected. Everyone was having a good time. People were talking. Kids were running around. Relatives were catching up with each other. Before I knew it, it had gotten late. Several family members suggested that I stay the night and drive home the next morning. Honestly, it would have been the smarter choice, but I had worked the following day and didn't want to deal with waking up early and driving back at the last minute. So I decided to head home that same night. At first, the drive wasn't bad. The roads were quiet. The weather was fine. There wasn't much traffic. For the first half hour or so, everything felt normal. The route home mostly consisted of long stretches of road surrounded by thick trees and bushes. The kind of roads you often see in horror movies. No houses, no stores, no gas stations. Just endless darkness on either side. During the daytime, those roads probably looked peaceful. At night, they felt completely different. The headlights only illuminated a small section ahead of me, while everything else disappeared into blackness. Still, I wasn't worried. I had driven those kinds of roads before. The real problem wasn't the road. The real problem was how tired I suddenly became. It happened almost instantly. One moment I felt fine. The next moment I felt exhausted. Anyone who has driven long distances at night probably knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's like a switch flips inside your brain. Your eyes get heavier. Blinking takes more effort. The road begins to feel endless. I tried opening the window. I turned up the music. I adjusted my seat. Nothing helped. The tiredness kept getting worse. I knew continuing to drive wasn't safe. The problem was that there was nowhere to stop. I kept looking for a gas station, a rest area, a parking lot, anything. But every mile looked exactly the same. Trees, bushes, darkness. I knew I needed sleep. Even 20 or 30 minutes would probably help. Eventually, I made a decision. Looking back, it wasn't a great decision. I spotted a section of road where the grass beside it was relatively flat. There were thick bushes nearby that partially hid the area from passing traffic. I pulled off the road and parked behind them. My thinking was simple. I wanted to be out of sight. If anyone drove past, they probably wouldn't even notice my car. At the time, that seemed comforting. Now I realize it also meant nobody would notice if something went wrong. Before falling asleep, I looked at the clock. 11:22 p.m. For some reason, I remember that exact time clearly. Maybe because of everything that happened afterward, I leaned my seat back, closed my eyes, and within minutes I was asleep. I don't know how long I slept before the first sound woke me. At first, I wasn't even fully awake. I just heard a strange scratching noise. A rough scraping sound, like something brushing against the outside of the car. Half asleep, I opened my eyes and checked the clock. 11:50 p.m. The sound continued for a few seconds. Then it stopped. Silence returned. I sat there listening. Nothing, no more scratching. No movement, no voices, nothing at all. I was still incredibly tired. Too tired to investigate, too tired to care. I convinced myself it was probably an animal, maybe a branch, maybe something brushing against the vehicle. Whatever it was, it didn't seem important enough to leave the safety of the car, so I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. The second time was different, much different. I woke up again to the same scratching noise. This time, it was louder, more aggressive, and it didn't stop. I immediately looked at the clock. 12:40 a.m. Almost an hour had passed. That alone bothered me. If it had been an animal, why had it returned? And why now? The scratching continued, back and forth, again and again. My heart immediately started beating faster. I sat upright and stared through the windows. Everything outside was dark. For a moment, I just listened. Then I slowly looked into the rear view mirror. And that's when I saw movement. Just for a second. A figure. Something running away from the vehicle toward the trees. The glimpse lasted only a moment before it disappeared into the darkness. That was enough for me. At that point, my imagination was working overtime. Every scary story I'd ever heard suddenly came rushing back into my head. The idea that someone had been touching my car while I slept was terrifying. I didn't care who it was. I didn't care why they were there. I had no intention of finding out. I started the car immediately. The engine roared to life. I pulled back onto the road and drove away as fast as I safely could. At first, I felt relieved. I was moving. I was leaving. Whatever had been outside was now behind me. Then I reached a bend in the road. Just beyond the curve, I saw another vehicle. It was parked on the side of the road. The driver's door was wide open. That alone was strange. Most people don't leave their vehicle sitting on a deserted road with the door open in the middle of the night. As I passed, curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down slightly and looked toward it. The car appeared empty. No driver, no passengers, nobody standing nearby. Just an abandoned-looking vehicle sitting there in the darkness. I remember feeling uneasy. Then I checked my rear-view mirror. Nothing. The road behind me appeared empty. For a brief moment, I started convincing myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe there had been some innocent explanation. Maybe, then, I saw him. A man suddenly came sprinting around the corner behind me. Not jogging, not walking, sprinting, running as hard as he could. His arms were waving wildly, and he was screaming. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough. Hey, you, get out of your car. Now. The sound of his voice instantly erased any remaining doubt in my mind. Every alarm bell in my body started ringing. Nothing about the situation felt normal. Nothing about it felt safe. A strange man running toward me in the middle of nowhere at nearly 1 a.m. while demanding I get out of my car? Absolutely not. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the accelerator and got out of there as quickly as possible. Within seconds, the distance between us started growing. The man became smaller in my mirror. Then, he disappeared completely. I never saw him again. I never learned who he was. I never learned why he was there. I never learned whether the car belonged to him or someone else. And honestly, I don't think I want to know. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe his vehicle had broken down. Maybe he genuinely needed help. But none of his actions suggested that. People who need help don't usually spend an hour scratching at strangers' vehicles while they sleep. And they definitely don't sprint out of the darkness screaming for someone to get out of their car. To this day, whenever I think about that night, I wonder what would have happened if I had ignored the scratching and stayed asleep. What would have happened if I had gotten out of the car to investigate? What would have happened if I had actually listened to him and stopped? Those questions still bother me. Thankfully, I'll never know the answers. What I do know is this: if you're exhausted while driving, find somewhere safe to rest. A gas station, a rest stop, a hotel, anywhere with lights and people around, because while falling asleep on the side of a deserted road might seem harmless at the time, sometimes you wake up wishing you had chosen somewhere else. A few summers ago, I had an experience that still creeps me out whenever I think about it. What makes it scary isn't that anything actually happened to me. It's the fact that something easily could have, and to this day, I still don't know whether the man I encountered was simply unstable, incredibly angry, or genuinely dangerous. It was summertime, and like a lot of young people, my friends and I spent many nights outside just riding bikes, talking, and wasting time. There wasn't much else to do. The weather was warm, school was out, and staying indoors felt like a waste of a perfectly good night. One particular evening, a friend and I had been riding around town for hours. Nothing unusual happened. We talked, we joked around, we explored different neighborhoods. Eventually, it got late enough that we both decided it was time to head home. It was around midnight, not extremely late, but late enough that most people were already asleep. The streets were quiet. There were very few cars around. The city had that strange nighttime feeling where everything looks familiar, but somehow different. At the end of the night, my friend and I went our separate ways. The ride home should have taken me only a few minutes. I lived close by. In fact, I only had a couple of blocks left before I reached my street. Unfortunately, there was construction happening nearby. Parts of the road were blocked off, forcing cyclists and pedestrians into awkward routes. Because of that, I ended up riding along the sidewalk instead of the road. Normally, I wouldn't have bothered, but there wasn't much traffic, and it seemed easier than navigating around the construction barriers. Everything was fine until I approached the corner where I needed to turn left onto my street. That's when I noticed him. A man walking alone. At first glance, he didn't seem particularly threatening. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s, a little scruffy, a little rough around the edges, but nothing that immediately stood out. In my city, seeing someone like him wasn't unusual. The downtown area had plenty of people walking around at all hours. Some struggled with mental health issues. Some were just heading home from work or from bars. Most people minded their own business. So I wasn't alarmed. The only problem was that the sidewalk was narrow. Very narrow. I was coming up behind him on my bike, and there wasn't enough room to comfortably pass without warning him first. The last thing I wanted was to startle someone in the middle of the night. So when I got a few feet behind him, I called out, "Hey, behind you." Simple, polite, just enough warning so he knew I was there. The reaction I got was not what I expected. The man spun around immediately, and the look on his face sent a chill through me. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't annoyance. It was pure anger, the kind of anger that seems completely disconnected from the situation. His eyes locked onto me. For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. Then, I turned left onto my street and continued riding. I assumed that would be the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. Almost immediately, I heard shouting behind me. At first, I couldn't even process what was being said. Then, the words became clearer. The man was screaming, not just yelling, screaming, profanities, threats, insults. He was calling me every name imaginable. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. He started threatening to kill me. The words echoed down the empty street. There was nobody around, no witnesses, no nearby groups of people. Just me, my bike, and an incredibly angry stranger. I looked back. He was following me. Not casually walking, actually following me. At that moment, I faced a problem. I lived only a short distance away. My house was practically around the corner. If I continued directly home, he would immediately know where I lived. That thought terrified me. So instead of heading home, I kept riding. I decided to circle the block. My plan was simple. Stay moving, create distance, hopefully lose him. At first, it seemed like the right decision. I rode around the block and eventually approached my street again from another direction. That's when everything got much worse. As I looked down the street toward my house, I saw someone standing on my front steps. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I realized who it was. The same man, the exact same man, standing on my front stoop, completely still, looking out toward the street. Waiting, I felt every hair on my body stand up. The thing that terrified me wasn't simply that he was there. It was that I had no idea how he knew where to stand. I had intentionally avoided going home. I had purposely ridden away. Yet somehow he was standing directly in front of my house. The odds felt impossible. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe he had seen me come from that direction earlier. Maybe he was guessing. I don't know. But at that moment, it felt like he somehow knew exactly where I lived. And that thought was horrifying. I slowed slightly as I passed. The man saw me. I know he did. Our eyes met. But this time he didn't yell. He didn't chase me. He didn't say a single word. He simply stood there, watching. That silence was somehow worse than the threats. Because now I had no idea what he was thinking. I had no idea what he planned to do. I had no idea how long he had been standing there. I only knew one thing. I wasn't going home. Not while he was there. I immediately turned around and headed back toward my friend's house. The ride felt much longer than before. Every shadow made me nervous. Every person I passed made me look twice. My imagination was running wild. Eventually, I reached my friend's place and stayed there instead. I texted my mom and explained what had happened. Naturally, she was concerned. But at the time, nobody really knew what to do. The man was gone by the time anyone could have checked. There was no immediate evidence that anything criminal had happened. Just a very disturbing encounter. Life eventually returned to normal. Or at least it seemed to. Then 2 days later, my bike disappeared. It had been stored in the alley behind the house. One day it was there. The next day it wasn't. Gone, maybe it was unrelated. Maybe it was just bad luck. Bikes get stolen all the time. I know that. But the timing always bothered me. Only 2 days after a man threatened me, followed me, and somehow ended up standing outside my house, my bike vanished. Could it have been connected? I honestly don't know. There was never any proof. No witnesses. No camera footage. Nothing, just a feeling. A really uncomfortable feeling. Even now, years later, that's the part that sticks with me. Not the yelling, not the threats, not even the stolen bike. It's the image of that man standing on my front steps in complete silence, watching the street, waiting, because in that moment, I realized something that most people don't think about. Danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks completely ordinary. Sometimes it's just a normal-looking man walking down a sidewalk on a warm summer night. And sometimes, for reasons you'll never understand, that person decides to follow you home. To this day, whenever I ride through quiet streets late at night, I still think about him. And I still wonder how he ended up standing exactly where he did. When I was a kid, I thought I had the coolest parents in the world. Most children had strict bedtimes, especially on school nights and weekends. But my parents were a little different. They knew I loved staying up late. Part of the reason was my older sister. She was an incredibly light sleeper, and if I stayed awake in our shared bedroom, I would usually end up waking her up. To avoid constant arguments, my parents came up with a solution. On weekend nights, they would let me sleep in the living room. To me, it felt like freedom. I would drag a blanket onto the couch, turn on the television, and stay awake watching whatever happened to be on late at night. Back then, one of my favorite channels was Nick at Night. I loved watching old sitcoms and reruns long after everyone else in the house had gone to bed. At the time, it felt like the greatest thing ever. The house would be completely quiet. The lights would be off. Everyone would be asleep except for me. I felt grown up, independent, like I was getting away with something special. Of course, every single weekend ended exactly the same way. No matter how determined I was to stay awake until sunrise, I always fell asleep on the couch. Usually without even realizing it. One particular night started exactly like all the others. I was curled up under a blanket in the living room. The television was still on. The glow from the screen flickered softly across the room. Outside, everything was silent. We lived in rural Georgia, far away from busy city streets. Our property was surrounded by trees, not just a few trees, hundreds of them. Towering pines and thick woods stretched in every direction. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, it could feel completely isolated. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I suddenly woke up. Not gradually, not slowly. Instantly, the kind of awakening where you're fully alert before you even understand why. Something felt wrong. Even now, I struggle to describe it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a nightmare. It was more like an instinct, a feeling, that strange prickling sensation that tells you something isn't right. I sat straight up on the couch. My heart was already beating faster. For some reason, I immediately looked toward the front window. The moon was bright that night, bright enough that the trees outside were clearly visible. Their shadows stretched across the yard. The entire landscape was painted in silver moonlight. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, I saw it. A silhouette. Someone was in one of the trees. I froze. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The figure wasn't standing near the tree. It wasn't walking through the yard. It was actually in the tree, high enough that it stood out against the moonlit sky. Just sitting there, watching. I remember staring at it, hoping I was mistaken. Maybe it was a branch. Maybe it was a strange shadow. Maybe I was still half asleep. Then our family dog exploded into action. He charged toward the window so fast that it nearly gave me a heart attack. His entire body became rigid. The fur along his back stood up. He began snarling viciously at the glass, not barking playfully, not reacting to an animal. This was the kind of growling that comes from genuine aggression, the kind that says something is wrong. That was all the confirmation I needed. I jumped off the couch and ran. I don't think my feet even touched the floor properly. I sprinted straight to my parents' bedroom. I burst through the door, panicking and trying to explain what I had seen. My words barely made sense. I was talking too fast, pointing toward the front of the house, trying to explain that there was a man outside, a stranger, in a tree. My parents immediately woke up. My dad could tell I was genuinely frightened. He wasn't the type of person who ignored things like that. Without hesitation, he grabbed something to protect himself and headed outside. The dogs followed him immediately. I stayed behind with my mom. She wrapped her arms around me while we waited. I remember sitting there listening. Every little sound made me jump. I kept imagining someone hiding outside, watching the house, waiting. The minutes felt endless. Eventually, my dad came back. He looked around the entire property, checked the trees, checked the yard, checked everything he could think of. But he hadn't found anyone. According to him, nobody was there. No footprints, no movement, nothing. He reassured me that everything was okay and told me to go back to sleep. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something real. The living room suddenly felt impossible to return to. There was no chance I was sleeping there again that night. So I went back to my bedroom instead. My sister was awake by then. Naturally, she wanted to know why I had just woken up the entire house. I told her everything. About the figure, about the dog, about Dad searching outside, about how scared I was. She listened quietly. The room eventually settled back into silence. My dad stayed awake. Every now and then I could hear him moving through the house with a cup of coffee, checking windows and making sure everything was secure. That made me feel better. A little. Eventually I started convincing myself that maybe it really had been a shadow. Maybe my imagination had taken over. Maybe the moonlight had created an illusion. Kids imagine things all the time, right? As the minutes passed, I slowly began relaxing. The house was quiet. The dogs were calm again. My dad was awake. Everything seemed fine. I remember finally thinking to myself, okay, maybe I can sleep now. Then I looked toward my window and saw him, standing outside. The same figure, the same man, only this time he was much closer. For a moment my entire body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. The moonlight illuminated enough of him that I could tell he was real. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, a person. Standing outside my bedroom window, looking directly at me. Then he did something that has stayed with me for years. He raised one finger to his lips, a shushing gesture, as if telling me to be quiet, as if he knew I had seen him, as if he didn't want me to tell anyone. The moment felt unreal, like something from a nightmare. Then, without a word, he turned around and ran. Not casually walked away. Ran straight into the darkness, disappearing between the trees almost instantly. I completely lost it. The fear that had been building all night finally exploded. I started crying. Not just a few tears, full panic, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath. The kind where every worst-case scenario floods your mind at once. I remember feeling completely helpless. No matter how many times my parents reassured me afterward, I couldn't calm down. I kept replaying what I had seen. The figure in the tree, the dog growling, the man at my window. that finger pressed against his lips. The silent warning, the way he turned and vanished into the darkness. Eventually, morning came. The sunlight made everything feel normal again. The woods looked peaceful. The yard looked harmless. The fear slowly faded, but the memory never did. Years later, I still remember every detail. I still remember the moonlight. I still remember the dog snarling at the glass. And more than anything, I still remember looking out my bedroom window and realizing the stranger I thought had disappeared was standing right there watching me. To this day, that remains one of the most terrifying nights of my entire life. Because unlike a ghost story or a nightmare, this wasn't something imaginary. There was someone outside, and for reasons I'll probably never understand, he wanted me to stay quiet. One of the strangest memories from my childhood is something that, on the surface, sounds very simple. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody got hurt. Nobody was chased. No crime was ever proven. And yet, decades later, I still think about it sometimes because there was never any explanation. No answers. No closure. Just a bizarre moment that left my family feeling unsettled. At the time, my younger brother and I were very little. I was probably around 6 years old, and my brother couldn't have been older than 4. Like most kids that age, we spent a lot of time outside whenever we had the chance. This particular day was during the winter. Everything was covered in snow. The yard looked completely different from the rest of the year. The trees were bare. The air was cold enough to sting your face, and the ground was buried beneath a thick white blanket. To us, it was perfect. Kids don't care about freezing temperatures when they're having fun. My brother and I were outside playing in the snow, completely absorbed in whatever game we had invented that day, making tracks, throwing snow, running around. The usual things children do. I remember the world feeling very quiet. We didn't live in a busy area. In fact, one thing that made our house unique was how hidden it was. Our driveway was long and somewhat secluded. You couldn't easily see the house from the road. Most people driving by would never even notice the driveway entrance unless they were specifically looking for it. Because of that, unexpected visitors were uncommon. When someone drove up our driveway, it usually meant they knew us. Family members, friends, neighbors, people who had a reason to be there. That's why what happened next felt so strange. While we were playing, I noticed a car slowly coming up the driveway. It was white. That's one of the few details I still remember clearly. A white car moving toward us through the snow. At first, neither of us thought much about it. Cars occasionally came to visit. Maybe it was someone stopping by. Maybe it was a family friend. Maybe it was a relative. As kids, we didn't really question it. We just stopped what we were doing and watched. The car continued moving forward until it got close enough that we could clearly see the driver. Then it stopped. The engine remained running. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's window slowly rolled down. I remember seeing a man sitting behind the wheel. He wasn't someone I recognized. At least, not that I can remember. He had short hair. He had a goatee. And he looked directly at us. As children, we simply stood there. Neither of us felt immediate danger. We were too young to understand that something unusual was happening. We probably assumed he was going to ask for directions or say hello. Instead, the man reached for something. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. Then I realized it was a camera, not a phone. This happened long before everyone carried cameras in their pockets. It was an actual camera. The man lifted it toward his face, pointed it directly at us, and took our picture. I remember standing there completely confused. No greeting, no explanation, no conversation. just a stranger taking a photograph of two small children standing in the snow. The whole thing lasted only a few seconds. After taking the picture, he lowered the camera, rolled the window back up, put the car into gear, and drove away. That was it. No wave, no smile, no explanation. Nothing. Within moments, he disappeared back down the driveway and out of sight. My brother and I were left standing there wondering what had just happened. At the time, I don't think either of us fully understood how strange it was. Children tend to accept unusual things more easily than adults. We probably talked about it for a few minutes and then went right back to playing. To us, it was simply a weird interruption. The real reaction came later, when our mom found out. I don't remember exactly how the conversation happened. Maybe we mentioned it casually. Maybe she saw the tire tracks. Maybe a neighbor noticed the car. But eventually she learned what had happened. And unlike us, she immediately understood how unsettling it was. Her reaction is actually what made the memory stick with me. I remember how concerned she looked, how serious she became, how many questions she started asking. What did the man look like? What kind of car was it? Did he say anything? Had we ever seen him before? Where did he go afterward? The problem was that we were little kids. We didn't have many answers. All we really knew was that a stranger had driven up our hidden driveway, taken a picture of us, and left. That's it. No explanation ever came. Nobody ever returned. No one called. No one knocked on the door asking for directions. No one admitted taking the photograph. The entire incident simply ended as suddenly as it began. Looking back now as an adult, I find it much stranger than I did at the time. There are innocent explanations, of course. Maybe the man was a photographer who thought the snowy scene looked interesting. Maybe he was documenting rural areas. Maybe he got lost and decided to take a picture for some random reason. There are countless possibilities. But the thing that always bothered my family was the location. Our driveway wasn't somewhere a person would casually stumble upon. You had to intentionally turn into it. You had to intentionally drive all the way up, and then, instead of speaking to anyone, he simply took a photograph and left. That's the part that never made sense. Years passed. Life moved on. The story became one of those strange family memories that occasionally gets brought up during conversations. Every time it comes up, everyone asks the same question. Who was he? And every time the answer remains exactly the same. We have no idea. The man was never identified. The photograph was never found. And whatever reason he had for taking that picture disappeared with him. Maybe it was completely harmless. Maybe it wasn't. We'll probably never know. All I know is that somewhere out there, unless it was eventually lost or destroyed, there may still be an old photograph of two little kids standing in the snow, taken by a stranger who appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. And honestly, that's what still makes the story feel so unsettling all these years later. Not what happened, but the fact that nobody ever found out why. There are some experiences that stay with you, not because they were violent or dramatic, but because you can never fully explain them. This is one of those memories for me. Even now, years later, I still think about it from time to time. Whenever I do, I find myself asking the same questions. What did I actually see? Why did it feel so real? And why, out of everything that happened that night, do I remember the feeling more than anything else? At the time, I had fallen asleep in the living room. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes I would stay up watching television and eventually drift off on the couch without bothering to move to my bedroom. The living room was comfortable enough, and when you're tired, the nearest place to sleep usually becomes your bed. That night seemed completely ordinary. Nothing strange had happened during the day. Nothing was bothering me. I wasn't watching horror movies. I wasn't telling ghost stories. As far as I can remember, it was just a normal night. At some point, I fell asleep. Then, without warning, I woke up. Not gradually. Not the way people usually wake up. There was no stretching, no sleepy confusion, no slow adjustment to being conscious. 1 second, I was asleep. The next second, I was completely awake. Wide awake, the kind of awake where every sense suddenly feels sharp. For a few moments, I just lay there. The room was dark. The house was quiet. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up. Then I heard it. A low, growling sound. Immediately, I recognized it. My cat. That alone was unusual. My cat wasn't the type of animal that growled for no reason. Normally, she was calm and relaxed. Hearing that sound instantly got my attention. I slowly turned my head. My cat was staring across the room, completely focused on something. Her body was tense. Her eyes were locked on a specific point in the darkness, and she was still growling. That's when I followed her gaze. At first, I couldn't make out much. The room was dark enough that details disappeared into shadows. Then, I noticed it, a shape, standing across the room. It wasn't perfectly clear, more like a silhouette, a dark outline against the darkness. But it was large. Large enough that I immediately recognized something was there. The shape appeared vaguely human, not detailed enough to identify, not detailed enough to see clothing or features, just the outline of something that looked like it could be a person. I remember staring at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. My first thought should have been that it was furniture, or a coat hanging somewhere, or some ordinary object creating an illusion in the darkness. But that wasn't what I felt. What I felt was certainty. Not certainty about what it was, but certainty that it was looking directly at me. I couldn't see eyes. I couldn't see a face. Yet somehow, I felt its attention fixed on me. That feeling is difficult to describe. It's one thing to see something strange. It's another thing entirely to feel watched. The room suddenly felt much smaller, much quieter, much heavier. I slowly sat up. Every movement felt deliberate. Careful. Part of me expected the shape to disappear once I moved. Part of me expected my eyes to adjust and reveal some perfectly normal explanation. Neither happened. The shape remained exactly where it was. Still, silent, watching, I leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look. The shape didn't react. It didn't move. It didn't change. It simply remained there. My cat continued staring, still tense, still focused, still acting as though something was in the room with us. Minutes passed. At least it felt like minutes. Maybe it was less. Maybe it was more. Time behaves strangely during moments like that. I remember sitting there completely focused on the silhouette, neither of us moving. Me watching it watching me. The silence became almost overwhelming. Normally, situations like that should become more frightening with time. Fear should build. Panic should increase. That's what makes what happened next so strange. Without warning, a feeling came over me. Not slowly, not gradually. Instantly, a feeling of complete peace. The fear vanished. The tension vanished. The anxiety disappeared. It was as if someone had flipped a switch inside my mind. One moment I was staring at this unexplained shape in complete silence. The next moment I felt perfectly calm. Not brave, not curious, simply peaceful. Comfortable, safe to this day, that's the part I find hardest to explain. Because nothing about the situation should have made me feel that way. Yet somehow I did. I remember lying back down. Not nervously, not reluctantly, completely relaxed. The shape was still there. The room was still dark. My cat was still watching. Yet I suddenly felt no concern at all. Within moments, I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Sunlight filled the room. The darkness was gone. The strange atmosphere had completely disappeared. For a while, I wondered if I had dreamed the entire thing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half asleep. Maybe my brain had created something that wasn't really there. Determined to find an explanation, I walked around the living room looking for anything that could have created the silhouette. A chair, a lamp, a pile of clothes. Anything. I examined every corner, every piece of furniture, every shadow. Nothing matched. Nothing created the shape I remembered seeing. Nothing stood in the location where the silhouette had appeared. That realization didn't make me feel better. If anything, it left me with more questions. Because if it wasn't an object, then what exactly had I been staring at? Over the years, I've come up with plenty of possible explanations. Maybe I was experiencing a form of sleep paralysis without being physically frozen. Maybe my eyes were creating patterns from the darkness. Maybe my brain was still partially dreaming. All of those explanations are possible. Maybe one of them is correct. But regardless of the explanation, the memory itself has never faded. I still remember the darkness. I still remember my cat growling. I still remember the shape standing silently across the room. And more than anything, I remember that sudden wave of peace that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, but it was certainly one of the strangest. And while I may never know exactly what I saw that night, one thing is absolutely true. I haven't slept in the living room since. There have been a few strange experiences in my life that I still can't fully explain. Most of them can probably be dismissed as coincidence, imagination, dreams, or simple misunderstandings. But every once in a while, something happens that sticks with you for years. Not because it proves anything supernatural. Not because you know exactly what happened, but because it leaves you with questions that never seem to go away. One of those experiences started when I was a child. For as long as I can remember, I had the same dream over and over again, night after night, year after year. It wasn't one of those dreams that changes every time you have it. It was always the same, exactly the same. I would find myself standing near the ocean. Sometimes I could see the shoreline, sometimes I couldn't. But I always knew I was near a massive body of water. Then it would happen. A giant wave would rise in the distance. Not a normal wave. Not something you could swim through or outrun. It was enormous, towering over everything. I would watch it approach, feeling completely helpless. No matter what I did, there was nowhere to go. The wave would crash down over me. The force would pull me underwater. And then I would sink, slowly deeper and deeper into the darkness below. I can still remember the feeling, the silence, the pressure, the helplessness, the sensation of looking upward and seeing the surface getting farther away. No matter how many times I had the dream, it always ended the same way. I drowned. Then I woke up, breathing hard, heart racing, covered in sweat. For most children, recurring dreams eventually disappear. This one didn't. It followed me throughout my childhood. Years passed. The dream remained. Sometimes it would disappear for a few nights. Then it would come back. Exactly the same as before. Eventually, I got used to it. It became part of my life. Just another strange thing that happened while I slept. As I got older, the dreams slowly became less frequent. By the time I reached college, it had almost completely stopped. Life became busy. Classes, work, friends, the dream faded into the background. Something I occasionally remembered but rarely thought about. Then one summer, something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was in college and had taken a temporary job delivering mail. It wasn't exciting work, but it paid well enough and kept me busy during the break. Most days followed the same routine. Drive from house to house, drop off mail, move on to the next address. Nothing unusual ever happened, until one particular afternoon. I remember the weather was warm, the neighborhood was quiet. I was working through my route like any other day. As I approached one house, I noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on her front porch. That wasn't unusual. Many people sat outside during the summer. What caught my attention was that she appeared to be waiting, not reading, not relaxing, waiting, specifically watching me approach. As I walked toward the porch carrying the mail, she never looked away. Her eyes remained fixed on me. At first I assumed she was simply expecting a letter. Maybe she was waiting for something important. When I reached the porch, I prepared to hand over the mail. Before I could say a word, she spoke. Her voice had a noticeable foreign accent, soft, calm, matter-of-fact. The kind of tone someone uses when stating an obvious fact. She looked directly at me and said, "You drowned when Oceania sank beneath the waves." That's it. No introduction, no explanation, no context, just those words. For a moment I genuinely thought I had misheard her. I stared at her, waiting for clarification, waiting for her to explain what she meant. She didn't. She simply continued looking at me, completely serious, completely calm, as if what she had just said made perfect sense. Meanwhile, my brain was trying to process what had happened. The words immediately connected to those childhood dreams. The drowning, the giant wave, the sinking. All those years of seeing the same thing night after night suddenly came rushing back into my memory. A chill ran through me. I remember standing there frozen for a moment. Part of me wanted to ask what she meant. Part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Finally, I handed over the mail and moved on. The interaction couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it stayed with me for years. As I continued my route that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What had she meant? Why would she say something like that to a complete stranger? How could she possibly know about the recurring dream I'd had for years? Of course, logically, she couldn't. There was no way. The rational part of my brain understands that. Maybe she believed in reincarnation. Maybe she regularly said unusual things to people. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the reference to drowning simply happened to match something personal from my childhood. All of those explanations make far more sense than anything supernatural. And yet, the timing was strange. The wording was strange. The certainty in her voice was strange. Everything about the encounter felt unusual. Years later, I still remember her face. I still remember the porch. I still remember the exact words she used. Most random conversations disappear from memory within days. This one never did. Even now, whenever I think about those childhood dreams, I remember that old woman. And whenever I remember that old woman, I think about those dreams. The two memories have become permanently connected. I have no idea what she meant. I have no idea why she said it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just one of those bizarre moments life occasionally throws at us. A strange coincidence that feels far more meaningful than it really is. But I'll admit something. Every now and then, when I see old photographs of massive ocean storms or read stories about ancient civilizations lost beneath the sea, those words still echo. in the back of my mind. You drowned when Oceania sank beneath the waves. And for a brief moment, I feel the same chill I felt standing on that porch all those years ago. This happened several years ago, and even now it's one of the most terrifying nights I can remember. I've experienced scary situations before. I've heard strange noises in the middle of the night, seen things that turned out to have perfectly normal explanations, and had moments where my imagination got the better of me. But this was different. What made it so frightening wasn't just what happened. It was how helpless I felt while it was happening. At the time, the rest of my family had gone on vacation. For the first time in a long while, I had the entire house to myself. Most people would probably see that as a good thing. No interruptions, no noise, no one telling you what to do, just complete freedom. At first, that's exactly how I saw it. I decided I was going to enjoy having the place to myself. Looking back, I probably enjoyed it a little too much. That evening, I drank quite a bit. Enough that by the time the night rolled around, I was feeling pretty good. The house itself had always had a strange layout. Our home sat farther back on the lot than most of the other houses in the neighborhood. The sidewalk stretched alongside the living room and ended directly at the front porch. The front door opened straight into the living room. The strangest feature, though, was the windows. They were huge, massive panes of glass that stretched across much of the front wall. During the day, they were great. They let in tons of sunlight. The living room always felt bright and open. The downside was privacy, or rather, the complete lack of it. Anyone walking up the sidewalk could practically see into the entire room. At night, especially when the lights were on inside, it sometimes felt like living inside a fish tank. Still, I had never really worried about it. That night, after drinking, I stretched out on the couch in the living room. My bedroom was all the way down the hall. For some reason, the idea of walking through the dark house felt like too much effort. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was laziness. Either way, I decided the couch was good enough. The couch sat directly beneath those giant front windows. I remember glancing up at them before drifting off. The darkness outside looked endless. Then I fell asleep. The next thing I remember is waking up suddenly, not slowly, not gradually. One moment I was asleep. The next moment I was fully awake. For a few seconds I just lay there staring into the darkness. I had no idea what woke me. The room was quiet. The house was still. Yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. A chill ran through my entire body. Not the normal kind of chill you get from cold air. This felt different. The kind of chill that seems to come from pure fear. The kind that makes every hair on your body stand up. I lay perfectly still, trying to listen. Trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. Bang! The sound exploded through the room. I nearly jumped out of my skin. For a second I couldn't even tell where it had come from. Then it happened again. Bang! This time I knew. It was coming from directly above me. The window. Someone was hitting the window. I froze. Completely froze. Slowly, without moving the rest of my body, I opened my eyes wider and looked upward. A figure was standing outside, right outside the glass. Someone was there, and they were pounding on the window. The sight instantly drained every bit of alcohol from my system. My heart started hammering against my chest. I remember wanting to move, wanting to jump up, wanting to run, but I couldn't. Fear pinned me to the couch. The figure remained there, banging again and again and again. Each impact echoed through the room. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the middle of the night. Without moving my head, I glanced toward the cable box. The digital clock glowed softly in the darkness. 3 a.m. Exactly the kind of time you never want something like this to happen. The banging continued. Whoever was outside showed no signs of leaving. Minutes felt like hours. I kept waiting for it to stop, waiting for the person to walk away, waiting for some logical explanation. Instead, the pounding continued. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence, complete silence. For a moment I felt relief. Maybe they were gone. Maybe it was over. I didn't move. I didn't dare move. I simply listened. Then the noise started again. Only this time it was worse. Much worse. Now there were two different sounds. One person was still pounding on the window. At the exact same time, someone else started banging on the front door. The sound came from two directions at once. Window, door, the realization hit me immediately. There wasn't just one person outside. There were at least two. That thought terrified me more than anything else. I was completely alone. Nobody else was in the house. No family. No neighbors close enough to hear. Just me. And whoever was outside. The pounding continued relentlessly. Every few moments I expected the glass to shatter. Every few moments I expected the door to burst open. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Robbery, home invasion, a prank, drunk strangers. None of the possibilities made me feel any better. I considered calling the police. I considered running to another room. I considered 100 different things. Yet somehow I remained frozen in place, listening, waiting, hoping. The strangest part was how long it lasted. This wasn't a quick prank. This wasn't someone knocking once and leaving. It went on and on. The people outside seemed determined to get a reaction, a response, any sign that someone was inside. I gave them nothing. I stayed silent. I stayed still. And eventually, after what felt like forever, it stopped. Not gradually, just stopped. The banging ended. The silence returned. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Nothing. Whoever had been outside was finally gone. Even then, I didn't relax. I don't think I slept for the rest of the night. Every tiny sound made me jump. Every creak in the house sounded suspicious. I kept staring at the windows, expecting someone to appear again. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When sunlight finally filled the room, I felt like I had survived something. I checked outside. There was no obvious sign of who had been there. No explanation. No answers. Just an empty yard and a lingering sense of dread. The experience stayed with me for a long time. For weeks afterward, every noise outside made me nervous. Every unexpected knock at the door made my heart race. Eventually, I got tired of being alone in the house. The next day, I called one of my friends and asked if he could come stay with me for the rest of the week. I thought he'd understand. I thought he'd be supportive. Instead, after listening to my story, he paused for a second and said, "What the hell for? So we can both get murdered in our sleep?" That was his response. Not exactly comforting. I remember laughing despite how scared I still was. Mostly because it was such an awful thing to say. To this day, I still don't know who those people were. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know why they chose my house. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was something worse. I'll probably never know. But even now, years later, whenever I see a house with giant windows facing the street, I immediately think back to that night, and I remember what it felt like to wake up at 3 a.m. and find a stranger standing just inches away on the other side of the glass. I've rewritten it in your requested style. Simple English, smooth flow, emotional storytelling. No headings, no bold text, and expanded significantly while staying close to the original story. When I was 17 years old, I had just gotten my driver's license. Like most teenagers, having a car and the freedom to drive felt amazing. Suddenly, the world seemed much bigger. You didn't have to wait for your parents to take you somewhere. You didn't have to rely on buses or rides from friends. If you wanted to go somewhere, you simply got in the car and drove. At that age, my friends and I were always looking for something exciting to do. We lived in an area where there wasn't much entertainment for teenagers, so we created our own adventures. One of our favorite hobbies was exploring abandoned places, old houses, empty buildings, forgotten properties. Anything that looked mysterious immediately caught our attention. Part of it was curiosity, part of it was boredom, and part of it was the thrill of finding a place nobody else seemed to know about. Over time, we found several abandoned houses that became popular hangout spots. Some were small, some were run down. Some looked like they might collapse if you leaned against the wall too hard. But none of them compared to one particular place. I discovered it completely by accident. Every day after work, I drove the same route home. One evening, I noticed a massive, unfinished house sitting back from the road. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Not abandoned in the usual sense. More like construction had simply stopped one day and never resumed. The structure itself was huge, far bigger than most homes in the area. It looked like someone had started building their dream house and then suddenly disappeared. The walls were up. Parts of the frame were complete. But there were no signs that anyone actually lived there. The property stretched far behind the house as well. A huge piece of land surrounded by trees and brush. The entire place looked strange, mysterious, almost hidden. Naturally, I told my friends about it. At 17 years old, a giant unfinished house in the middle of nowhere sounded like the ultimate discovery. One afternoon, I was hanging out with one of my closest friends before we planned to go see a movie. Since we had some time to kill, I suggested we drive by the house so he could see it for himself. He immediately agreed. It was summertime. The sun had already started setting. The sky was filled with that orange and purple light that only appears during dusk. Even though there was still some daylight left, I already had my headlights on. We drove out to the property, talking about how perfect it would be for a future party. As we approached, the place looked exactly as eerie as I remembered. Huge, empty, silent, I pulled into the front of the property. We sat there looking at the house. Honestly, we couldn't have been there for more than 10 seconds, maybe less. We never got out of the car. We never walked around. We never explored. We simply looked. Then I turned around and headed back toward the road. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed headlights behind us. A truck, a very large truck. At first, I didn't think much of it. People drive on roads. That isn't unusual. But within moments, it became obvious something wasn't right. The truck was getting closer, much closer. Its high beams flooded the inside of my car with light. The driver was practically glued to my rear bumper. My friend noticed it too. We exchanged a quick glance. Neither of us said much, but we were both thinking the same thing. Why was this guy driving so aggressively? I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was in a hurry. Maybe he was just an impatient driver. We continued toward the main road. The truck stayed right behind us the entire time. The closer we got to the intersection, the more uncomfortable I became. When we finally reached the traffic light, I prepared to turn right. The truck was still directly behind us. The light changed. I made my turn. That's when things got weird. Instead of simply following the road, the truck suddenly cut through the gas station sitting on the corner. 1 second it was behind us. The next second, it was racing through the parking lot. Before I even understood what was happening, the truck had pulled directly in front of us. Blocking our path, I slammed on the brakes. My heart immediately started pounding. The truck stopped. Its headlights remained shining directly into us. For a second, neither my friend nor I said a word. Then, the driver's door opened. Out stepped one of the largest men I had ever seen. He looked enormous. Broad shoulders, massive frame. The kind of person who instantly makes you feel small. At that moment, my friend and I were absolutely terrified. We were 17-year-old kids, alone, and now a giant stranger had intentionally blocked our vehicle. Neither of us knew what was going to happen next. The man walked toward my driver's side window, slowly, calmly, that somehow made it even worse. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He looked completely in control. He reached the car and tapped on the window. Not aggressively, just enough to let us know he expected it to come down. I looked at my friend. My friend looked at me. Neither of us had any idea what to do. Finally, I rolled the window down, just a little, enough to hear him. The strange thing was what happened next. This intersection was usually busy, very busy. Cars everywhere, people constantly moving through. Yet at that exact moment, it felt deserted. I don't know if that's how it really was, or if fear simply made it feel that way. But I remember noticing how empty everything seemed. No other cars, no witnesses, just us and him. The man leaned slightly toward the window. Then he asked a simple question. What were you doing at that house? The moment he said it, my stomach dropped. He wasn't guessing. He knew exactly where we'd been. He had clearly come from the property. Maybe he had seen us. Maybe someone else had. Whatever the reason, he knew. My brain immediately started searching for an answer. The truth sounded terrible. Hi, we're teenagers scouting abandoned houses for parties. Not exactly convincing. So I lied. Quickly, I told him we had simply been turning around, that we'd taken a wrong turn and used the driveway to make a U-turn. The words came out faster than I intended. I remember hoping he wouldn't ask more questions. The man stared at us, just stared, for several long seconds. It felt like minutes. Neither of us moved, neither of us breathed. I honestly thought he knew I was lying. Then something happened that still bothers me. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, not an angry smile, just a smile. The kind of smile that gives away absolutely nothing. For a moment, I had no idea what he was thinking. Then he nodded, stepped away from the car, and told us to go. That was it. No threats, no warnings, no explanation. He simply let us leave. Neither of us waited for a second invitation. The moment he moved, I drove away. Fast, very fast. Neither of us spoke much for the next few minutes. We were both trying to process what had happened. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was probably nothing. Maybe he was a caretaker. Maybe he was a security guard. Maybe he owned the property. All of those explanations made sense. Yet something about the encounter never sat right with me. Years have passed since then. The strange part is that the house still sits there. Unfinished, exactly the same. Construction never resumed. Nobody ever seemed to move in. Nothing changed. Every time I pass it, I think about that evening. About the truck. About the high beams. About the giant man blocking the road. And about that smile. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for everything. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. But to this day, whenever I drive past that unfinished house, I can't help wondering what was really going on there. And part of me still suspects that whatever it was, we probably got a lot closer to it than we should have.